Welcome today to our webinar today. Roger Longman examines how payers make reimbursement decisions. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to join today's webinar. My name is Irene Fitzgerald and I will be your moderator today. Before we get started, I want to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how to participate in today's webinar. First, you should have a control panel on the right side of your screen. Towards the bottom of the control panel is the Q&A pane. You may submit questions or comments in writing using the Q&A pane during the presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded and everyone will receive an email with a link to view the recording of today's event. So let's get started. Our presenter today is Roger Longman, CEO of Real Endpoints. Real Endpoints is a startup company focused on pharmaceutical reimbursement and aiming to help both payers and product developers improve the value of pharmacotherapy. Late last year, Informa signed a major partnership with Real Endpoints to bring its products and expertise to the biopharmaceutical industry. Until November 2009, Longman was Managing Director of Pharma at Elsevier Business Intelligence, a Reed Elsevier company. He has been involved with the healthcare industry for more than 25 years. From 1990 through 2008, Longman was co-CEO and Managing Director of Winhover Information, a company providing analysis and data around pharmaceutical and medical device business strategy. Through publications, databases, and conferences, Longman co-founded and built the company through internal development with publications such as In Vivo, Startup, and the RPM Report, several databases including the Strategic Transactions Database and a series of senior executive conferences, and through acquisition. In 2008, Windover was acquired by Reed Elsevier and merged with its FTC Reports division, publishers of the Pink Sheet, Gray Sheet, and many other medical industry newsletters, creating Elsevier Business Intelligence. Longman ran the company's group pharmaceutical business until he left in 2010 to begin working on Real Endpoints with Norman Shelby, who had been Windover's chairman and lead investor. Over the years, Mr. Longman has been recognized as an expert in the biopharmaceutical strategy and often speaks at key industry events organized by important trade organizations, investment banks, and venture capital firms, and leading pharma and biotech companies. He lectures regularly at several leading universities and co-directed the Wharton-Windover Pharmaceutical Program at the Wharton School. Mr. Longman completed his BA at Cornell University and an MA at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and then taught for 3 years at the European Division of the University of Maryland. Now, we will get started. Roger?
Thanks, Irene. Appreciate it, and thanks everyone for joining. We're going to be talking about payers today and trying to understand how they work. I guess a major point I'd like to make to start with is that this marketplace, the payers, is not a single group of folks with the same kinds of incentives. In fact, it's a very different, it's made up of many different kinds of people with many different incentives. And I sort of divide the world loosely into what I call real payers, the guys who actually put their hands into their pockets and pull out money to pay for healthcare and drugs, and payer agents, those people who are tasked with helping those real payers spend their money appropriately. So, you know, we're talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of $375 billion, which is what IMF said what we're spending in the U.S. And if you look at these real payers, we're looking at CMS, which runs Medicare and Medicaid, and they are, to an interesting degree, handcuffed in their ability to manage their spend by their own regulations. Employers have historically been reluctant to get involved in decision-making, leaving that to their agents, but they are increasingly frustrated, in particular, by the fast rising cost of specialty drugs. And then patients, who are also payers, have, of course, rely on their physicians, rely on their insurance companies and their PBMs, but they are also increasingly pressured by what is now called by the financial toxicity of drugs. Then let's talk about the payer agents, and we'll go into this in a little bit more detail. I hope not to do it in boring detail. But if you look at how they do business, they can actually make more money by increasing drug spend, occasionally, not always. So one of the things you have to look at with insurance companies is the various lines of business and how the various lines of business that they have, Medicare, Medicaid, commercial, now the exchanges, how they make money in those lines of businesses. And then there are the PBMs, and PBMs are increasingly dependent on revenues from specialty drugs through specialty pharmacy fees that they can charge, through rebates, and through other ways of charging money. From the employer's point of view, or one of the actual real payers, the problem is increasingly worrisome. So this is Equity Healthcare. Equity Healthcare is a company owned by Blackstone, which essentially manages the health benefits of all the Blackstone companies. Blackstone is a very, very large private equity player. This is a note from Bob Galvin, the CEO of Equity Healthcare, in which he breaks down his spending, and he's looking and saying, well, look, my trend overall is just above 4%, but if I didn't have specialty drugs increasing my spend, my trend would be at 0. Or if he's looking at it a different way, he's looking at utilization going down, price going up, price for all sorts of products and services, in part because hospital costs are going up as hospitals merge and can charge more. But it's specialty drug costs that are the big driver for him, and he's of course not unusual. What they're looking at, and what concerns the actual payers, is the huge number of specialty drugs which are coming out. So it's not merely the fact that existing specialty drugs are increasing their costs, which they are to a degree, but it's also the new specialty drugs that are coming down the pike. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, but it is what folks are increasingly concerned about, particularly when you see forecasts from groups like Express Scripts or CVS saying that specialty spend is soon going to be half of total U.S. drug spend, which is to say a few percentage points of total prescriptions are going to in fact be represent half of the total spending. So let's look for a second at the payer agents, two in particular, the PBMs and the insurers. And the value proposition of a PBM is to manage costs more efficiently for sponsors and for payers through a variety of techniques. But as I said before, a large piece of their revenue is based on increasing drug sales, and particularly as a percentage of drug price. And then you've got insurers, and again, they've got different lines of business. And each line of business has different economic considerations. And therefore, each line of business may have different incentives for which drugs they choose. And there's just, and how this affects employers is that they're getting more and more concerned about the incentives and the roles of their agents in the drug decision-making process. And there was an interesting article in the Pink Sheet just a few days ago talking about an employer insurance alliance in which what they're trying to do is to figure out, are there other ways that they can save money that they are not being directly told by their insurers or their PBMs, which stands for Pharmacy Benefit Manager. So let me talk about how a rebate works. This is a very simplified example, but the Pharmacy Benefit Manager promises an employer, say, a $60 guaranteed rebate on every prescription. And then as part of that deal, the PBM and the employer split that rebate. Now, sometimes the PBM gives the vast majority of the rebate to the employer, sometimes he doesn't, but it can be up to a 50-50 split. So think about this on an $85,000 specialty drug prescription, in this case an $85,000 prescription for hepatitis C virus therapeutic with a 40% rebate. That 40% represents $34,000 on that $85,000 price. The employer gets $17,000, the PBM gets $17,000, the manufacturer nets $51,000. Now, if that drug had been a lot cheaper with a much smaller rebate, that employer might have actually paid less than what he pays with this pretty significant rebate. And then let's talk about insurance companies and the plans and how they look at things. So again, I'm only going to go through a couple of different lines of business here, but I'm going to give you a hypothetical examples of how rebates work for plans. So in this case, I've got two lines of business up on this chart. There's the ASO, Administrative Services Only plan, in which an employer is not at risk. He pays his premium to the insurance company, and the insurance company takes on the medical risk, which includes the cost of drugs as well as the cost of all the other healthcare expenses. Now, this is the same $14,000 drug, same rebate, 20% rebate and a 45% rebate. And you can see that with a 20% rebate, oh gosh, I said this backwards. This is an ASO plan. I completely, sorry, my mistake. This ASO plan in which the employer is taking on the complete risk of the insurance, of the cost of health care. So the insurance company is simply managing those costs. So the insurer is not on the hook for the drug cost or on the, and often not on the hook for the health care cost. So a rebate to that plan, granted that plan can keep some of that rebate and not pass the entire part of, pass it off entirely to the employer, the plan can actually make money on that drug. The bigger the rebate, of course, the more money he makes. On the other hand, if you look at his at a PDP plan, very different economics. In this case, the PDP plan, this is a prescription drug plan. This is when the Medicare beneficiary just signs up for a drug plan. The PDP plan, the Medicare PDP plan, is not responsible for the healthcare cost. So in this case, can be very, very different economics, same drug, same issue. But a 20% rebate, he can be losing money. A 45% rebate, he can be making money. And then if you look at the fully insured plan, which is an employer who does not take risk but pays the premium to the plan, again, very different incentive. In this case, the plan may very well not want to cover these drugs because, of course, the plan is at risk for them. He has to charge the employer enough in his premium to cover these costs. So so when a drug company thinks about pricing, thinks about talking to plans, he's not talking to a single person. He is thinking about how, or he should be thinking about, how that plan makes money from the different lines of business that, that in fact he's involved with. Now, given the increasing costs, given those increases in specialty drugs, drug expense that we've been talking about, it's also true that employers, payers, are getting more and more interested or willing to do things that they would not have been willing to do before. And specifically, they are willing to restrict choice for their beneficiaries or employees. And this has become a big issue. And their agents, the CVS and Express Scripts, which are the two biggest PBMs, are increasingly following their the wishes of their clients and figuring out that if they can exclude competitors from the marketplace, they will be able to get better deals on the drugs that they include. And so what you're seeing over the last several years is a fairly dramatic increase in formulary exclusions. This is the number of drugs on the national formularies of CVS and Express Scripts, which are, in fact, now excluded. So who am I talking about? Well, CVS excludes Vicurapax, and for the most part, ESI excludes Gilead's drugs. CVS excludes several of the GLP-1 agonists, and ESI excludes others of the GLP-1 agonists. Most interestingly, in 2016, I think, they've moved from excluding small molecule drugs, GP drugs, which are easier to exclude in general, to excluding biologicals. And the most, I think, significant change that we saw in late 2015 when this was announced was CVS deciding to exclude the market share leading interferon in multiple sclerosis, Avonex, in order to be able to include other interferons, which it considered, for its own reasons, appropriate and equally beneficial. What's striking about this is that most physicians hate the idea of switching a stabilized patient who is on a biological to a different biological. But that is, in fact, what CVS has done here. They're forcing patients to switch unless those patients want to pay out of pocket. Now, those exclusions are, as I say, kind of the most draconian way of cutting into market share or preventing companies from, brands from getting market share. But payers are also increasingly using utilization management or restrictions in coverage policies to limit the use of drugs. So we just took most of these restrictions out of United Health, but you could look at plenty of other plans. So PCSK9s, the new lipid-lowering agents out of Amgen and Regeneron-Sanofi partnership, highly restricted with the restrictions you see here. And I should point out that the launch of those drugs has been pretty miserable. Similarly, Novartis says that there's lots of restrictions on the fabulous heart failure drug Entresto. Again, really challenging launch. Harvoni, lots of restrictions. They've had an excellent launch, but remember that came with a really, really significant rebate. Now, it's not true. It's true that not all drugs have these same kinds of, or that restrictions can cut the use of all drugs. So Vertex has had a really marvelous launch of Orkambi, despite some real restrictions. Now, plans have not been able to, incidentally, implement the kinds of outcomes-based contracting, making sure that the drug works in order to pay for it, that I think they would like to do. But nonetheless, the point here is that some companies have been able, despite significant restrictions on the use of the drug, to do quite well with them. One thing that has allowed this increasing ability that plans have to restrict the use of drugs, one important change has been in physician power. Physicians have been forever the marketing target of pharmaceutical companies. They have, as a almost part, it could almost be part of the Hippocratic oath relative to drugs, do not restrict my ability to prescribe the drug that I want to prescribe. But increasingly, they are willing to concede some of that prescribing power to payers. And part of this is because they're looking at payers differently, and payers are looking at them differently. So in the old days, there were very few payers who were willing to piss off physicians, because if the physician decided, he could walk out of the network, and that would be a big problem for the insurer. But we've now seen more and more insurers going with essentially narrow network plans, and that leaves physicians out in the cold if they don't play by the insurer's rules. The second big change has been in the incentives for the physicians. Many physicians, increasing numbers of physicians, are at some risk for the cost of care. Most of them are not yet really at risk for the cost of pharmaceuticals within that, but there are more and more that are, and they expect to be. And so that's also going to be changing how they view changing their willingness to allow other people to restrict them in their prescribing freedom. And finally, they are concerned about a new element of toxicity among drugs, and that's this new phrase, financial toxicity. They are aware that patients are paying more copay, more out-of-pocket for these drugs, and they're increasingly sensitive to that problem and willing to prescribe drugs that cost patients less out-of-pocket, which often is a choice made by a payer. Now, how are payers justifying their choices? Well, one thing they're doing is they are increasingly aware of and using these new outside assessment tools. In oncology, NCCN, the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, has put out their evidence blocks, which survey the committee members who are deciding on guidelines about the various value elements of different drugs for specific cancer for specific cancers. ASCO has a value framework that can help oncologists look at the different drugs and decide which one is better and have conversations with patients. Memorial Sloan Kettering's Peter Bach has come out with his drug Abacus, and just to be completely transparent, we worked on that with him with our RX scorecard technology. ICER has now been doing these technology assessment reports. It's done them in HCV, it's done them in PCSK9s, it's looking at some other areas as well, and we ourselves here at Real Endpoints have our RX scorecard, which is again being used by more and more payers and frankly more and more pharma companies to also assess the relative value of these drugs in an objective way. And what's important to think about in terms of these tools is that they are, whether they're actually having an effect on behavior or whether they're actually predicting behavior, I can't say, but it is true that they are beginning to, you can look at them and start seeing what the future is going to look like. So we ourselves, back in July, before the PCSK9s were priced or indeed were approved, said that because these drugs were comparable, because they lacked key data in our assessment, that the payers were going to restrict these drugs' use quite significantly. And it was going to be more significant than certainly the stock market analysts were predicting. And then ICER in September, after the drugs were priced, said, look, we don't think that this is going to be, we don't think there's going to be substantial uptake until the price goes way, way down. Now, what was the result? The fourth quarter sales of Praluent, the PCSK9 inhibitor from the Regeneron-Sanofi partnership, those sales were dramatically lower than expected. Indeed, when the fourth quarter sales came out for Praluent of $7 million, they were 1/3 of a consensus which had been consistently reduced over the last half of last year. And then at least Leerink, the analyst at Leerink, said that the forecast was going to be further reduced by 50 to 70% for the next few years. So let me now move on to another issue, sort of an example of how rebates work and how they work in the context of utilization management and other kinds of restrictions. And I'm looking at the new drug launched by Merck just a few weeks ago, Zepatier for HCV. It's a very good drug, and most dramatically, it is significantly cheaper than the list price of the competitors, Viekira and Harvoni. But we think it's going to have some challenges gaining traction for many of the reasons that I've talked to you about so far. So the drug was approved recently. It really is a better drug, I think, than Viekira, at least in terms of adherence and convenience issues, and it's equally efficacious, mostly, to most uses of Harvoni and to Viekira, and it's substantially discounted, as I say. And so when we look at it, we assess it in these drugs in three basic domains: economics, safety and use, and efficacy. And in essentially the largest U.S. patient population, which is the genotype 1 treatment-naive patients, this drug looks great. It does as well as the others, and you know, should be a real opportunity for plans and for Merck to do really well. The problem stems from where it doesn't work so well, and those are in much smaller populations. In particular, those patients who have moderate to severe cirrhosis. Now, yes, those are small populations, and I will get to that and get to the implications of that. But but in those populations, the competitors, Harvoni in particular, and the new drug that's coming out from Gilead, the combination of velpatasvir and sofosbuvir, or Velsof, they actually do work in those populations, and Velsof is likely to also work in all sorts of other genotypes. It could be, in fact, one-stop shopping. Now, when you then dive down into say, well, what does this mean that it only that Zepatier and frankly Vicurapac only work in those other a few of those indications, or don't work in those key small indications. What does that mean? Well, it means that in those smaller indications, for a plan that prefers Zepatier, they will have to buy Harvoni at a non-preferred, non-rebated price in order to treat those patients. And when you add up the likelihood, the cost of using a non-rebated Harvoni in those populations, you see that in fact it actually could be cheaper to prefer a Harvoni, even a Harvoni that is more expensive than Zepatier. In this case, what I assumed was a really radical discount on Zepatier, a $32,000 price. It's now, I think, $55,000 or $56,000. And I used the Harvoni preferred rebate or post-rebate price somewhere in the $40,000 to $52,000 range, depending on the number of weeks one gets Harvoni therapy. And when you do that, you really do begin to see things in a different way, so that Harvoni becomes a really interesting challenge for Zepatier. Now, it's not to say that Zepatier doesn't have some real opportunities. I think that, for example, in Medicaid, it may in fact do quite well, depending on pricing and depending on a whole variety of things, like whether or not Harvoni is, Gilead with Harvoni is going to do a bunch more discounting. But it is an intriguing example of how you have to look at how you have to analyze the drug from the payer's point of view to really see how payers are going to be incentivized to choose one or the other. One final point before I start to sum up, and that is this. The more important payers become, the less important certain verities of the pharmaceutical industry become, or the more questioned they become. And in particular, I think the most important is this notion that the drug companies, that has been accepted by the drug companies for years and years, which is that what you want to do is you want to launch a drug either first in class or you want your drug to be best in class. Those have significant advantages in a physician-dominated world. When you could market to physicians and you were the first guy out there onto the market, you could convince them to start using you, and once physicians started using you, they generally didn't change quickly. That gave you an advantage in terms of pricing. If your market was kind of stuck on you, you could continue to increase the price. Similarly, if you could show that you had a best-in-class drug, a best-in-class from the point of view of the physician, you could get those physicians to switch, you could get those physicians to accept you, and once you had demonstrated that, it was very difficult for other folks to come in and get them to switch. But as payers take over, as payers become more and more important, that best-in-class definition is going to start changing. It's going to be regularly reevaluated. Payers are going to, as they're willing now to, as we saw with Avonex, as they're willing now to exclude certain drugs, even market share leading drugs, payers are going to look at the new drugs and evaluate them as objectively as they can to see what's really best. And thus that when you think about what companies have done in the past in order to create either a first-in-class or best-in-class drug, you're going to see different strategies. So it's certainly true, and companies are still doing this, that they favor speed to market. So if I can get to market first, that's worth something. Well, if it's worth less, in the future than it is today, then the things that have helped drug companies get to market first will also be less worthwhile. I'm thinking, for example, of the priority review vouchers, which have been sold for significant amounts of money. Similarly, companies have prioritized certain endpoints over others in order to get to market faster because the others will take longer. Those could be a poor, those kinds of choices could be poor. From our point of view, the companies who are going to win are those who demonstrate what we're calling best value in class. And that value is dependent not on merely how physicians think of things or how a company's R&D group thinks or how a company's marketing group thinks, but how payers think about it, how payers are going to define value. And it's when thinking about those definitions, and they're complicated, it's only by meeting those definitions that companies are going to create the acceptable return. So, to sum up, the to-do list for biopharma, I think, is 4 major points. The first one is understand clearly how your customers make money. If you don't understand that, you're shooting in the dark. The second thing is to understand clearly the new ways that customers are, the new techniques customers are using to limit the use of products. Third, the value of best-in-class and first-in-class is shrinking. It's important to focus on best value in class. And finally, figure out how customers are assessing the value of these drugs. They're using these as outside tools. Get to know them, get to know what they're saying about your drugs, and then get to know how to use them to your advantage. So, with that, I will close. If you've got questions, please use the Q&A panel in the control, the Q&A pane in the control panel to submit questions. I've already got a bunch. Or if you'd like to get your questions answered later, email them to pharma@informa.com. So, let me start. What is a PBM? I think I've answered that. That is a pharmacy benefit manager, which is, as I say, an organization whose goal is to help employers, sponsors, and other payers to more efficiently manage their pharmacy spend. Another thing, we've heard from managed care organizations that PBM exclusions apply only to PBM plans, and that, for example, Express Scripts still has to process Harvoni claims for United. What are your thoughts on this? Well, it's true. If the way that Express Scripts or CVS market its programs is to tell its customers that if they sign on to their fixed plans, their national plans, they can get the best rebates. But of course, certain customers do their own negotiation and want the PBMs to provide the drugs that they want them to provide. It won't be the same deal that the PBM gets, but it will be, in fact, the deal that the, in this case, United has, that the payer or that the employer prefers. So it could be a smaller rebate, but again, it could also be a lower price. And third question, what factors aside from cost are taken into consideration when making coverage decisions? Well, in the Zepatier Harvoni example that I gave you, it's clear that certain payers, certain insurance companies are going to look at at how broadly the drug can be used, how effectively the drug can be used. But there are plenty of others. So certain plans are going to say, are going to weight more heavily, for example, adherence characteristics. If adherence is extremely important, or exact adherence is extremely important to the value of that drug, it's possible that a plan will overweight or superweight the adherence issue. Other things could be dependent on toxicities. If toxicities, for example, are particularly expensive, they may look at that. There are plenty of considerations, and I'm happy to respond to more specific questions about that. There's lots of that. Good question. On slide 12, I talked about the power play between physicians and payers, but the drug moves are being made by PBMs, not medical benefits payers. Are the medical benefits payers influencing, dictating what the PBMs are doing? It's a delicate dance. Yes, they are. Yes, they want to. The issue for PBMs is the more people that they can, the more payers, the more employers they can get onto their national formularies, the better the rebates will be, and therefore the more money the PBMs will make. Clearly, the payers, the employers, may not want to go along with that, and may want their own specific choices used. They're willing to pay for that. Another question. The orphan disease area. I should say that in this case, the question is, do these restrictions, are they going to apply to the rare orphan disease category? And the answer is, by and large, not really. I already pointed out how well Vertex with Orkambi has done. There's a rule of thumb that I use. A lot of our payer customers use it one way or another, and that is what I call the 0.5% rule. If the drug is not going to increase medical spending by 0.5% or more, we don't have to spend so much time thinking about restrictions, all of which actually cost the payer money. They're not free. With the rare diseases, they rarely get to that 0.5% level. So for the most part, they don't really rise to the level at which a payer is going to get really restrictive. The other key point is I think that there are particular temperatures to different categories. So different categories will have different levels of restriction based on the emotional intensity around them. Cancer is a very good example. Why does cancer, there are many fewer restrictions in the use of cancer drugs, oral cancer drugs, pharmacy benefit cancer drugs, than there are, for example, in cardiovascular. Cardiovascular disease kills more people than cancer does, but for some reason it's just not as hot. The temperature just isn't as high. It doesn't have the same emotional quotient, I guess I could say. And when you think about orphan diseases, most of these have very, very high emotional quotients. So you combine the high EQ with the fact that these drugs generally don't have a huge impact on spend, and you see how things aren't, how I don't think that orphan drugs are going to be highly restricted. Question. Does this concept of, I guess, drug assessment or restrictions apply to biosimilars or just high-cost specialty drugs? Well, one, yes, it very clearly applies to biosimilars, and in fact, we're looking right now at RA and some of the biosimilars that are coming in there and assessing them relative to the branded biosimilars coming. This is going to be a huge issue, of course, depending on the cost of the biosimilars. This could dramatically reshape a number of different categories. If I'll give you one example, if there could be an effective, well thought of insulin biosimilar, that could really shake up the basal insulin market, which is extremely challenging, and a lot of certainly a lot of the plans that we're speaking with and who are looking at our stuff are very interested in a biosimilar approach to that indication, and of course to others. Another question. For most rebates given by manufacturers, does the insurer also get a rebate or only the patient? Okay. The patient does not get a rebate. The rebate is goes to either the PBM, either and or the employer or the insurer. So the patient doesn't necessarily see the cost reduction driven by the rebate. There should be a kind of parallel reduction in the patient's cost because he's moved to a preferred drug. The preferred drug is the one that gives the rebate. The preferred drug has a lower copay or out-of-pocket, but that's not necessarily how it works in real life, or certainly not all the time. In what ways and to what extent are payers and payers agents interested in working with pharma companies prior to drug launch? The answer is payer very much. One of the keys, I think, to an effective drug launch is an effective, a lot of effective discussions with payers. Now, this doesn't mean the kind of market research where you gather a bunch of payers in a room and you ask them, what do you think about this drug, or if this drug had such and such a profile, it would, how would you decide to pay for it? What I'm really talking about is stuff that that gets into a fairly intensive discussion with senior pharmacy people at plans about the relative value of the drug, and indeed the economics that the economic impact the drug or drug class is likely to have. Case in point, payers were completely unprepared for the economic impact of Sovaldi. It's a wonderful drug. I mean, it's, talk about a revolutionary, wonderful medical advance. But that drug was, at least the plans that we talked to, did not understand either the prevalence within their population of people with HCV, and therefore weren't expecting the explosion of usage, nor did they expect the price of that drug. One thing that experience, I think, has taught plans, and I hope it has taught manufacturers, although I'm frankly not sure that it has, is the importance of actually clear signaling of the likely economic as well as medical impact of a drug. Another question. Are the principles that you outlined here equally applicable in the European market? Not really. In the U.S., one of the key issues here is that we have competition among payers. So there are all sorts of guys competing for the business of employers and state Medicaid organizations and so on. In Europe, by and large, there are many, many fewer payers. Private payers have much, much less influence on things, and so a decision by a governmental technology assessment group carries much greater weight than the assessment by a single payer in the United States might have. That is, however, not to say that that in Europe they're not looking at similar issues. One big difference, however, is that in Europe people are willing to base value around quality, the quality adjusted life year metric. In the U.S. so far, nobody's been willing to do that. We've got time for just a couple of more questions, and I got like 40 of them. Excuse me. So let me try to pick through. My opinion on the transparency of rebates between PBMs and manufacturers. Could more transparency increase the flow of drug spend savings to payers and beneficiaries? Boy. This is a really difficult issue. Rebate transparency doesn't exist. When drug companies assign deals with rebates, part of the contract says the payer or the PBM can't reveal what the rebate is. And largely that's true because they don't want other payers to be able to leverage them down based on what one guy's discount is. It's the notion that there's going to be an increased there's ever going to be an increased transparency in rebates is, I think, far-fetched. It just can't happen given the current structure of how things are done. I think that more importantly, and one thing that I really do applaud Merck for with Zepatier, is I think that the less we start working with rebates and the more we start thinking about actual reductions in drug price, discounts relative to other standards of care, the more you can see a transparent system taking hold. Now, that's how likely that is, I don't know. The pharmaceutical companies have to work with PBMs closely. They're big influencers. They want to give, they want to incentivize PBMs to work with them, to prefer their drugs, and therefore, to some extent, they're kind of stuck with this rebate situation, this rebate mechanism. I've got time for apparently one more question. There are just so many. Let me. Okay. Here's one question that we'll try to answer quickly. Requires a lot of detail, but how does a payer choose between an IV drug and an oral drug since they are covered under different benefits? And what that means is that oral drugs and some injected drugs are covered under what's called the pharmacy benefit. Those are far more easily restricted, managed by the plan because they're the ones who are, they've got arrangements for buying those drugs. The infused drugs are delivered by the providers, and the provider pays for them, and often the plan doesn't actually get all the information it needs. So those are very different. They're very different processes, and it's very difficult for most plans to manage the infused drugs, the so-called medical benefit drugs. That could be changing. More and more plans are trying to get a handle on that. But to a large extent, that is also going to depend on whether the government can actually change how Medicare processes infused drugs and prices and rewards or pays physicians for using those drugs. So I am unfortunately at the end of my hour, and I have to let you all go. So I will end by thanking Informa for giving me the opportunity to talk with you today, and thanking all of you for joining. And with that, I'll sign off. Irene, it's back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Roger, and thank you everyone that joined us today. Again, as Roger stated, if you have any further questions or comments, please feel free to email them to pharma@informa.com. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.